Good morning. I don't know about all of you, but I really enjoy a good BLT sandwich. Well, in the book of Acts, we've got presented to us what I've started calling a PHP sandwich. PHP sandwich. It's a sandwich in the book of Acts about self-glorification, about trying to not just look good, but trying for others to see us as better than those around us. Self-glorification, trying to be seen as lifted up above others. And I want to talk about that first, and then we'll come back to this PHP sandwich, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. Self-glorification, trying to look good in the eyes of others, trying to look better than others around us in the eyes of others. Desiring a good reputation is a good thing. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 1. Proverbs chapter 22 verse 1. A good name, or a good reputation, a good name is to be more desired than great riches. Favor is better than silver and gold. That good name, it's a good thing to want a good name, a good reputation, so that others do think well of you because you have developed good qualities. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's a good thing. And we kind of instinctively want this. You know, it comes naturally to us to want others to think well of us. Yeah. But it's so easily corrupted into something evil. Self-glorification. I think many evil things, many sinful things, maybe, I've not been so bold as to assert this, but I think maybe every evil thing, every sinful thing may be a corruption of a good thing God has given to us. I want to give you 3 examples of that aren't really central to our lesson today, but illustrate this fact that so many times, maybe all the time, sinful things are a corruption of good things God has given us. Anger. God created within us the capacity for anger, and anger has a place. Paul says, be angry and yet don't sin. Anger itself is not a sin. It's something God has given to us. It becomes the motive to act in regard to some evil that is done that angers us righteously, and to act in regard to those situations and to correct those situations. But uncontrolled anger, which becomes the problem, lashes out to harm people, seeks revenge, and it loses that positive side of simply the motivation to act to correct something that should not be that way. Sexuality. Sexuality is a good thing God has given to men and women. It's a blessing within the marriage relationship. It's a great bond that helps people hold together through tough times, helps married people, married couples stay together through difficult times. But unfocused sexuality is lasciviousness and leads to disease and children that are born not into complete homes, and brings about the destruction of relationships, and creates a bond between two people who haven't necessarily decided that each other is the one they want to permanently commit to in marriage, but they've begun this sexual relationship, and so that bond, very special bond, is created, and they become blinded and think, well, yeah, I've got to be with this person, even though they haven't really rationally concluded that yet. The desire to work is a good thing God has given to us. You know, the animals, well, I shouldn't say that. That's when ad-libbing gets you in trouble. I started to say, even though it's not in my notes, animals don't have a desire to work. And yet in the Proverbs, you know, the ant is held up to us as a great example of working. But it is a different thing. There is something within us that is a desire to accomplish things and a desire to work. And that drives us. That drives men to support a family and to create good things. Good uncontrolled desire to work, when we take that God-given quality and twist it a little bit, an uncontrolled desire to work leads to men who are workaholics. They spend all the time working because they have this goal of becoming rich, and they work all the time, and they neglect their wives, they neglect their children, and they neglect their obligations to God because of this desire to work. So, many things that are sinful are corruptions and twistings of something that is good. Self-glorification is a corruption of a good thing, to want people to think well of us, that we have a good name, a good reputation. We've seen in Proverbs chapter 22, a good name is to be more desired than great riches. Also in 1 Timothy chapter 3, when Paul is talking to Timothy about appointing elders and what kind of men ought to be chosen and selected to serve as elders in the church. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7, in listing these qualities of such men, Paul says, and he must have a good reputation with those even outside the church, Paul says. So a good reputation is a good thing. But we are so talented at taking good qualities and twisting them to something evil. And so sometimes we search for glory, and we try to be lifted up in the eyes of others above other people around us. And so it becomes not just, I want people to think well of me, I want a good reputation, I want to be good so that I'll have a good reputation. It becomes, I want everybody to see me as better than everybody around me. Theodore Roosevelt, at least one incident in his life. I don't know Theodore Roosevelt all that well. I haven't studied him, but he was one of our presidents around the early 1900s. And he was a good example in this regard. Before he was president, before he ran for president, he was seen as someone who might serve as president. And newspapers started talking about him, and someone younger who worked with him said something to him one day about, everybody's seeing you as a presidential candidate. And Theodore Roosevelt reacted sharply to that fellow and said, don't even speak about that. Because he saw it as such a high thing and a high honor. And for him to just lightly assume, well, I could be president, it was something he thought needed to be treated with much more humility than the other one was acting like. I wish our candidates today were like that, or at least more like that. He was not seeking self-glorification. Some preachers seek self-glorification for the power over people that it brings them, for the money that it brings them. We sometimes seek admiration for its own sake. We sometimes want to be seen as better than those around us. Think hard about yourself for a moment. Think about things in your past. I think about this, and I see instances where it's happened. If you've ever done something or said something or wanted somebody else to say something about you so that people would lift you up and think of you higher maybe even than others around you, we have that problem sometimes. There is one who is worthy of lifting up, to be seen above others. That's God, our Creator, our Sovereign. And we're all down here below. In class this morning, Don was talking about how in Christ we are equal. And it's a mistake that we make when sometimes we're wanting to be seen as more than the run of things of people around us. When we want people to see us as lifted up, that self-glorification. All right, well, we've introduced that idea. Now let's get back to that PHP sandwich in the book of Acts. We're going to start with Herod. He is the H in the PHP sandwich. Herod Agrippa was king in Jerusalem. Turn with me to Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12, Herod is king in Jerusalem, but he doesn't just rule in Jerusalem. Sometimes he was in Jerusalem, sometimes he would go up to Caesarea. He had palaces in both places. In Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, now about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. What was his motivation in doing that? And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. Through the Gospels, we read about James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Here they are mentioned. Herod, King Herod, had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. Verse 3, and when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. He wanted people to see him in this very positive light. He wanted the glorification. And when he did something that the people loved, well, I'm going to keep doing more things like that. And so he arrests Peter, and presumably he's going to have Peter killed as well. Of course, in the following verses, we read about how Peter was miraculously released from that prison. And so we get down to verse 19, and we read, and when Herod had searched for him, sent to the prison to call for Peter, Peter's not there. And when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered them that they be led away to execution. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. You get a flavor for what Herod Agrippa was like. He has James killed with a sword. The people liked it, and that determined what he was going to do next. Oh, the people liked me when I did that. I'll do more of that because I want the glorification from the people, and so I'll arrest Peter also. This was in Jerusalem, but Peter, by the Spirit, escapes, and Herod leaves Jerusalem and goes up to Caesarea, where his other palace was. Now, the key verses are coming up here, beginning in verse 20. Now, he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. I'm not sure why he was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, but he was. And with one accord, they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. And on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. And the people cried out, "The voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. Herod loved the adulation of the people. And on this day, he appeared in such a way before them that they cried out, "The voice of a God and not of a man." I want to read you. Josephus was a Jewish historian of the first century. He was a Jewish historian who lived in Rome, who kind of worked for the Roman Empire, and he wrote a lot of history from the first century, particularly involving the Jews. And Josephus wrote about this very event, when Herod appeared before the people and spoke to them, and the people cried out, and then he died. And I want to read to you what Josephus wrote about this. Now, when Herod Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city Caesarea. That's what we just read. He left Jerusalem and went to Caesarea. And there was a festival. Josephus describes a festival that was going on at the time. And we'll pick up a bit later where Josephus says, and on the second day of that festival, he put on a garment made completely of silver and of a texture truly wonderful, and came into the theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment was illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, and shined out in a surprising way, and was so radiant as to spread shock over those who looked intently upon him. And presently his flatterers cried out from one place and another from another place, though not for his good, that he was a god. And they added, "Be thou merciful to us, for although until this time we have revered you only as a man, yet from now on we will own you as superior to mortal nature." Upon this, the king neither rebuked them nor rejected their impious flattery. And then a couple of lines about something else, and then a severe pain also arose in his belly, and began in a most violent manner. And when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life. That's Josephus' account of this same event that Luke tells us about in the book of Acts. He wears this silver garment, according to Josephus at least, and it shines in such a way that it was shocking to see. And the people, Luke tells us, cry out the voice of a god and not of a man. Josephus tells us that Herod did not rebuke them for that. He didn't say, no, I'm not a god, I'm just a man. He liked that glorification. He liked receiving that glory, even when it was so extreme as to call him a god. It's the problem with corrupting the God-given concept of a good name and a good reputation to the point that we want to be seen as above others, better than others. He was deified, and he accepted it. Now, I had seen this passage for years, and that's an interesting passage. But I had also thought, why does Luke tell us about that? You know, Luke doesn't tell us about every event of every king that lived in that part of the Roman Empire. Why does he tell us this story? Well, there is that lesson that we see there about self-glorification. But maybe there's more reason than that. And I finally noticed that as Luke writes the book of Acts, he sandwiches this account between two other accounts of two other men in somewhat similar situations, Peter and Paul. And so you have Peter in chapter 10, Herod in chapter 12, Paul in chapter 14, all three being revered as God. And we see how they responded. Peter, Herod, Paul, that's my PHP sandwich. That Luke didn't just happen to tell us a story about Herod, but he tells us a story about Peter, and then a story about Herod, and then a story about Paul. So let's go back to Acts chapter 10 and see the event with Peter. You know Acts chapter 10. Peter is on his rooftop and he sees this vision of the animals, and then at the same time the messengers from Cornelius show up, because Cornelius had been told by an angel to send for Peter so that he would hear words by which he would be saved. These messengers come to Peter and tell Peter about that, and so Peter agrees to go. Peter goes to Cornelius' house. And in Acts chapter 10, verse 24, and on the following day, he, Peter, entered Caesarea. Now Cornelius was waiting for them and had called together his relatives and close friends. And when it came about that Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet and worshipped him. See the parallel with Herod and how the people treated Herod. Here, now, in Herod's case, I think the people were partly amazed at Herod's appearance, but probably also partly just wanting to flatter the king. Here, Cornelius, I think, is being very sincere in this, and he thinks Peter is someone to worship. How did Herod respond? Herod enjoyed it. Self-glorification. How did Peter respond? Verse 26. But Peter raised him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am just a man." Peter wasn't interested in that kind of glorification. He didn't want to be seen as above Cornelius. He certainly didn't want to appear as someone divine and worthy of worship. And so when somebody began treating him that way, he immediately said, "No, no, no. That's not what I am. That's not treatment I deserve. I'm like you." Very different than Herod's response. And then we go to Acts chapter 14. Paul is on his first journey, and he arrives in Lystra, up in the region of Galatia, what is today Turkey. And there's a miraculous healing. And so we begin reading in chapter 14, verse 8. And at Lystra there was sitting a certain man without strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze upon him and had seen that he had faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he leaped up and began to walk. And when the multitude saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have become like men and have come down to us." And they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. These were two of the gods of the Romans, Zeus and Hermes. And the people begin saying, "Paul and Barnabas are those two gods, and they've become like men and come down to us." Verse 13, and the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, in order that you should turn aside from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." Paul and Barnabas didn't want to be glorified. They didn't want to be seen as someone above the others around them. Paul and Barnabas said, "We are men of the same nature as you." Drop down a few more verses to verse 18. And even saying these things, they, Paul and Barnabas, with difficulty restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. They would not accept it. They would not accept that kind of treatment. So that's the PHP sandwich. Peter, Herod, and Paul. And when I finally noticed that, I understood. Now I know better, more fully, why Luke tells us in the book of Acts about Herod's death. Because he was planning that. Here's the story of Peter when somebody called him worthy of worship. And here's the story of Herod when they treated him as worthy of worship, as a god. And here's the story of Paul when people treated him in the way that they would treat God. In those three short stories, Luke gives us a great lesson about self-glorification versus humility. Herod loved the glory. You know how kings are treated. I mean, we don't have kings in this land, but you know how kings are treated. You know how presidents are treated sometimes. You know how celebrities are treated sometimes. You know how a big fish in a little pond is treated sometimes. Some encourage that kind of thing. They want that glory that people around them give them. Some people seek that kind of glory. Some religious leaders do that as well. We look across the scope of what is today called, modern Christianity, and you can see religious leaders who soak up that glory. You can see some religious leaders maybe among the Restoration movement who seek that kind of glory, seeking to be lifted up, seeking that kind of admiration. And maybe we sometimes see it in our own lives. When we do things and say things and enjoy the comments of others because we feel lifted up above others around us. Not Peter, not Paul. In Revelation 22, we see not even an angel would accept that kind of glorification. Revelation chapter 22, verse 8. And I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed me these things. He was going to worship this angel. And he said to me, do not do that. I am a fellow servant of yours and of your brethren, the prophets, and of those who heard the words of this book. Worship God. John's going to worship this angel. Now, angels are something above us. But even an angel who is something above us says, I'm down on the level with you. In relation to God, the difference between men and angels is very small. So he says, I'm down on a level with you. I am a fellow servant of yours and your brethren, the prophets. I'm not worthy of the kind of glorification you're trying to give me. So, seek a good name. Seek to have a good reputation. Not just because people say so, but because you've lived a good kind of life that calls for that good reputation. Proverbs chapter 22, a good name is to be desired, more desired than things sometimes people do. And be glad for the good name that you have and the good reputation that you have. But to be seen as better or over others around us, that's the difference. We should be hoping for others to have an equally good reputation. Our hope shouldn't be, I always want to be seen as better than people. Our hope should be that we'll all have a good name, a good reputation. We should not seek glory and reputation over others. That is the realm of God. Also in Revelation chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. And every created thing which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and on the sea and all things in them, I heard saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and dominion forever and ever. He's the one who sits on the throne and the Lamb. That is who is worthy of this kind of praise. And we and even the angels are down here as servants, seeking a good name, yes, a good reputation. But we want everybody to be seen that same way. We want everybody to live in such a way that they have a good reputation as well. We don't want to be like Herod, who is exemplified to us as the one who sought that glory, to be seen as above others, to be seen as worthy of worship and unreasonable admiration. So I hope you'll think on those things as you go through the days of the days to come, and kind of examine yourself. I need to examine myself. We all need to examine ourselves to see if the things that we say and the things that we do are efforts to be seen more highly than others around. In a moment, we're going to sing our song of invitation. If you have need this morning to come before this congregation, to ask for prayers, to seek forgiveness, to be baptized into Christ, we'd ask that you come as we stand and sing.
Would you be free from your burden of sin? There's power